Well, hello, buddy. So good to see you. Good to be together. If you're joining online, watching from a different place, thank you, everybody in the room. Love it. Hey, before we jump into part number 2 of our series and follow, I would like to just kind of walk through something with you. So, sometime last year, I was just struck by something I read in the scriptures, and I don't know why. After years and years, it just stood out, and it seemed just so essential to explore this. So 2 passages of scripture in particular. One was the Great Commission, and if you're not familiar with the Bible, it's some of the final words that Jesus speaks to his followers before he ascends into heaven. And it says something like this: go into all the world, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them, and then teaching them, here's the key point, teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you, and I'll be with you always. And so the teaching, I began to think, I thought, well, we in the church spend lots of time teaching, but if you'll notice, Jesus said this: I want you not to just teach them, but teach to obey. And I started thinking about my own learning, and sometimes I love to just absorb information and know things about the Bible, but Jesus wants to teach me so that I obey, actually carry it out. And then there was one other scripture that came to mind, and it's Jesus telling a parable about 2 people who build houses. One, he says, is built on the rock, and one is built on the sand, and a storm comes, impacts both of them equally. The one whose foundation is built on sand is destroyed. The one on the house survives. And then explaining this parable to his disciples, he says this: the person who hears my words and puts them into practice is the one who builds their house upon the rock. And as I explored that in my own mind, I thought, well, that's what we really want, right? We all want lives that when difficulties and storms come, we're not destroyed, but instead we survive. And Jesus says, here's the difference. Some people can hear, but those who hear my words and put them into practice, so actually obey, those are people who develop the type of life that survives disappointment and things that just completely surprise you. It's building your house on a rock. So with that in mind, we began talking amongst the team, and we came up with this journal idea. I want to show this to you. So it's just being released this weekend, and it's called Teach Me. And there are 4 main things. It's designed to go over a 4-month period. And so we've tried to identify multiple things that Jesus taught us to do. And the goal of this is not just to read more information, but to slow down and over a month-long period, try to actually put into practice something that Jesus teaches us. So the first would be abide. Jesus has this conversation with his disciples. He says, I want you to abide in me. He's standing in a vineyard when he says this. He's talking about what it means. It's a biological concept. And so there are 4 weeks of thinking through and actually figuring out, how do I put into practice abiding in Jesus? And I'll teach about that next week, by the way. And then the second command is rejoice. The third command is deny, and the 4th is pray. And so this is designed not just to complete the workbook, but the point is this, is we want to actually put these things into practice. So I would love to invite you to jump in and work through this. You can work at your own pace. The goal isn't to fill out everything in here. The goal is to actually begin to do this in a concentrated 4-month process. Now, aesthetically, our team, I was really surprised. It was beautiful. Like it's artistic, it's great questions, lots of people contributed. And then if you're a parent or a grandparent, or I don't know what your situation might be, there's this journal, it's called Teach Us, and it's designed to just sit down and walk with kids. It's got questions along the same subjects. Now, my kids are all adults, so I can't do this with them. Dinner's so weird for Jenny and I now. It's just the 2 of us, and I'm not gonna have her do this with me. She wouldn't appreciate that. But we'll do this one individually and then talk about it. So both of these are available. I just think it's an opportunity for us to explore. One of my hearts is that we are all growing and maturing, and that we develop the type of lives that survive storms, and that we learn how to actually obey rather than just be cognizant of. So I would tell you though, These, if you do not have the resources, we'll find a way to make this work out. But it doesn't even cover the cost of these journals. These are $10. They're available in the Welcome Center, and these are $5. We're not trying to raise any money. It's just an opportunity to offset the cost. If you are watching from somewhere else, let us know. We'll find a way to get one of these to you. So I'd love for you to consider this exploration over the next 4 months. Sound good? All right. Hey, I want us to jump into our series. Last week, we began in concert with this concept. You'll notice that this wasn't by just chance. A series called Follow. And we're looking at one chapter in the Bible, Luke chapter 9. And it's this chapter where Luke, who's this brilliant man who writes one of the biographies of Jesus' life, he makes this transition in his book. For the first 8 chapters, he has 12 disciples who have been following and observing and watching. And then in Luke chapter 9, Jesus changes this whole thing. And he says, now I want you to do what I have been doing. And so it's all about this concept of discipleship. In Greek, the word is mathetes, and it's basically this concept. It was a way of learning in the first century where you followed a rabbi who was a teacher, and you learned what the rabbi knew. You emulated the rabbi. Your life was transformed by your rabbi or your teacher. And Jesus invites his followers into more than just belief. Belief is very important. We emphasize that. But you'll notice that Luke is saying Jesus didn't just want to have people who believed, but people who were engaged and people who followed. And in the process of following, their mentality changed. In the process of following, their hearts changed. In the process of following, they became healed, and they then could do what the rabbi, the teacher, Jesus did. So last week we only made it through the first 2 verses, all right? We're gonna reread that, and then I wanna go on and read several more verses and explore this idea of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Okay, let's begin. We'll reread the verses from last week and then explore some new ones. When Jesus had called the 12 together, that was our first point. Being a disciple means you come together first of all with Jesus and then in community with others. He gave them, that was our second point, is that God doesn't call us to do something and say, figure it out by yourself. He gave them what? Power and authority. There's an equipping that happens when you are a disciple of Jesus. And you better be equipped, because the next thing he's gonna ask you is really big. To drive out demons and to cure diseases. And he sent them out to proclaim the kingdom. So we notice this, that a disciple has a mission and a message. And the two need to be working in concert together. There's something you proclaim, that there is a new king, there's a new reality that people can live in, there's a new way of viewing, there's a new foreign policy, how we look at other peoples. So it's a kingdom of God and to heal the sick. Now, for these new verses, he told them, take nothing for the journey. No staff, no bag, no bread, no money, no extra shirt. That is a very light packing list, right? Very light. Whatever house you enter, stay there until you leave that town. If people do not welcome you, leave their town and shake the dust off your feet as a testimony against them. So they set out and went from village to village proclaiming. So they've got this message, the good news, and healing, their mission, people everywhere. Now, Herod, he's a puppet king. That would probably be the best way to describe him. Rome, one of the brilliant things they did is to keep their empire intact. They left some power with local magistrates. And so Herod had a role of influencing the kingdom of Israel, or Palestine is what the Romans called it. But he really didn't have any power. He was completely subservient to the emperor of Rome. Now, Herod the Tetrarch heard about all that was going on. He heard about what Jesus was doing, and then he hears that it's not just Jesus. He hears that his followers are doing the same thing, and he was perplexed. So his assumptions about who God was, about who Jesus was, are suddenly challenged. He doesn't know what to think because some were saying that John had been raised from the dead. Others that Elijah, who's an ancient Old Testament prophet, had appeared. And still others that one of the prophets of long ago had come back to life. But Herod said, I beheaded John. So what's behind this is John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin, who initiates the ministry of Jesus. John was this very bold person. He's in the presence of Herod, and he calls Herod out for living an inconsistent and immoral life. And Herod eventually has him beheaded. So I beheaded John. Who then is this I hear such things about? And he tried to see him. I love that. One of the most powerful people in the land has to see Jesus to figure out what in the world is going on. Okay, let's explore these verses. So what does it mean to be a disciple? Number one, being a follower of Jesus means I travel light. I've been on enough trips with enough people, missions trips, to know there is a vast difference in how some of us travel. Some of us have this enormous suitcase, and when you put it on the scale, there's this moment of desperation. Yes, that's been you, huh? Because it is overweight, and you're like ripping things out and stuffing it in your pockets because you've got 4 pounds to shed from that suitcase. And then some of us, we're like travelers. I went on a trip with somebody, I learned so much from him. He took like this tiny little day pack for a 10-day trip. And when he opened it up, everything is rolled and then held together with rubber bands. And I'm like, that is efficient, brother. I like that. Well engineered. And Jesus says to his disciples, I'm sending you on this extraordinary, overwhelming, high calling to go from village to village. And here's what I want you to take. Nothing. No money, no change of clothes, no staff, not even an extra shirt. Now that is traveling light. Last year, Jen and I were invited to the nation of Turkey. And we went there to speak to a group of there's some fantastic things happening, by the way, in Turkey. So we're there to speak with a group of leaders from around the country and some of the surrounding countries. And on the way, somewhere our baggage was lost. And so we show up in Turkey, and I've got to speak multiple times. And it was just awkward speaking in the same clothes day after day. You know, they're like, maybe we should take an offering for this poor guy. Like, he doesn't have any clothes. I didn't want to go buy anything because I kept thinking our luggage would show up. Our luggage showed up 6 weeks later in Billings, Montana. We're like, where's it been? 6 weeks? Like, what in the world? Packing light or not having anything with me was a terrible inconvenience. So why does Jesus say that if you want to be a disciple and you want to be on mission, you have to travel light? I think there's a couple things. Number one is I think Jesus is always desiring us to develop a life of dependence. Dependence on him. If you can't trust in your own resources, you can't trust in your finances, you can't trust in this strategic game plan. Every day, this is what those disciples had to do. They're going to a new village, and they don't have anything to give away. They can't start things off by like, here, we're offering free pony rides. Come and visit us. They have to go, and they just have to say, God, today, how are you going to do this? Because I don't have anything to offer anyone, and so I have to completely trust you. I think a disciple, one of the key things is we have to learn how to develop a lifestyle of dependence. And I'll tell you what, in our culture, which is one of the most prosperous, if not the most prosperous, the world has ever seen, this is very foreign to us. Because it is so easy for us to develop a dependency on other things. We are blessed with tremendous resources, but there is something about discipleship where I have to learn to trust, not in finances, not in some sort of strategic plan that lays out everything, But it's every day I get up and I say, I'm on mission with you, Jesus. And I'm trying to live out this thing called discipleship. And here's what I know. I do not have what it's going to take today to go to this new village, to meet that person, to address that situation. I don't have the resources, and so I lean on you. God does this throughout the scriptures. If you went all the way back to the ancient Hebrew Old Testament, he calls a man named Abram, who's eventually going to be called Abraham, and he says this to Abram, Genesis chapter 11, 12. He says, I want you to leave everything. I want you to leave your culture, your people, and to go to a land that I will show you. Where's that, Lord? No map, no agenda, no itinerary. So every day, Abram had to open his tent flap and say, where are we going today? Where are we going today? That's the type of dependency that develops true discipleship. It's not about comfort or convenience. It's about being as unencumbered as possible. So this whole idea of being unencumbered, why would Jesus say travel with nothing? Oh, here's what I find in our discipleship. We can become encumbered, meaning we're carrying things that are too much for us. We weren't designed to carry. We're carrying worries and concerns. We're trusting in other things. And I'm trying to follow Jesus, but I've got all this stuff, all my luggage. And I'm like, hey, can you slow down, Jesus? Because I've got all this stuff I need to bring with me. It can be something from the past. It can be fears, whatever it might be. Being a disciple means I have to find a way to disengage my heart from some of the things that bring me the most security, and enter into this new simplified way of living where I don't trust in my achievements, my abilities, my degrees, my finances, my intellect. I trust that every day Jesus will supply what I need to carry out his message. It's this tremendous life of simplicity. And I keep asking myself this question: what encumbers me? After decades of trying to follow Jesus, here's what I find. There are still things that I hold on to that slow me down in the journey. And I want to find a way to disentangle my life so that wherever Jesus is going, I'm following and I'm able to trust. And I really believe this. Here's a key thought. In order to do that, to leave things behind, I have to believe that God is a generous God, that he is a kind and compassionate God, that he is a God of abundance and not a God of scarcity. Because if my perception of God is he is not generous, he is not kind, I feel like I have to bring all this stuff with me, right? I've got to bring that with me because I'm not sure that Jesus will actually supply what I need. But if I can get in my mind that he is good, that he will care for me, that he is a God who gives love, that he actually gives power and authority, as we just read about, then I can leave behind the things that bring me personal security and say, hey, I trust you, Jesus. I trust that entering into this next journey, you're a God who will supply every need. And we're not talking about like massive wealth. We're talking about needs being supplied. So disciple travels light. Number 2, being a follower of Jesus means I deal with offense and move on. I deal with offense and move on. So Jesus puts in this really unique thing. He says, when you come to a city or a village and they reject you, I want you to shake the dust off your feet and move on. So interestingly, in first century Judaism, one of the traditions was this, Jews had this unique thought that they were chosen and everybody else had the potential to pollute them. And so if you had to journey outside of the boundaries of Israel before you entered back in, so there's usually some sort of rock marker to mark, okay, we're now at the boundary. So on this side of the marker, I've been outside of Israel. I would literally shake all the dust off my feet, step over the border, and it was this concept of I'm leaving behind the things that could potentially pollute me. And Jesus uses that idea, that concept. He says, it is inevitable that you will experience rejection and difficulty and pain. And I need you to shake that dust off and continue moving forward. So about a year ago, we had this beautiful experience where all our kids were home for a holiday. And somehow around the dinner table, this discussion came up about family mottos. Family mottos, like what's your family motto? I don't even know how it started. But the idea is that there's like an unspoken value in your family that governs and leads everything. And one of us asked, so what do you think our family motto is? What's the Poetzl family motto? And I had like really high hopes when I heard the question that one of my kids was gonna say something like, we follow Jesus with everything we have, whatever the cost. And they started bantering around, and one of my kids goes, oh, easy. I know our family motto. Well, what is it? You'll be fine. And I'm like, what do you mean? And all my kids like break into laughter. They're like, that is absolutely our family motto. We've heard that from when we were little kids. We fall down and mom and dad look at you and go, hey, you'll be fine. We come home from a really hard day at school. And what did mom and dad say? You'll be fine. That's their family motto. So it wasn't what I was hoping for, but it kind of lines up with this idea of, hey, life can be really hard. And you need to shake it off. You need to move ahead. Now, if we think that being a disciple of Jesus means this life of complete bliss, we're mistaken. It wouldn't take much to read the scriptures, and especially the New Testament. Look at the life of Jesus. I mean, here he comes, the only one who has lived this life that was sin-free and lived in obedience to his Father. And what does it cost him? He's beaten, he's humiliated, he's hung on a cross, he's executed. And 3 days later when he resurrects, he doesn't say, where are those Romans? Where are those Jewish leaders who manipulated the crowds to get me on a cross? What does he do? He shakes it off. He says, that was part of what needed to happen. And there is something for me to do. And I can't be held back by that thing that happened. The original 12 apostles, so there's a new one after Judas kills himself. But so these 12 apostles from the first century, it's a little bit hard to know specifics about them. But as far as we know from church history, all of them, but one, were martyred. They were martyred. They lost their lives. The one who wasn't was John. And John ended up, he was probably the youngest when Jesus called him, and he lives till he's 88 years old. Here's a little bit about what happened for John. He stays in Jerusalem and helps lead the church, and then Rome decides that he too needs to die. And from what we have written in church history, Rome chose this death for him, that he would be dumped in a vat of boiling oil. Doesn't sound like a good way to go. He somehow survives it. And as you can imagine, his body is covered in scars. And then he's sent to the island of Patmos because Rome wouldn't attempt to execute you twice. If you survived once, then you went into exile. And on the island of Patmos, he has this vision, which we know as the book of Revelation. And then somehow later in his life, he ends up being free from Patmos, and he ends up in the city of Ephesus. And we read this. Tertullian says this. It says that he was at the very end of his life. He's 88 years old. He's the pastor of the church in Ephesus. His body is covered in scars, and he can no longer walk. And so they bring him into his final church service, and he's on a stretcher carried by 6 young men. And as he comes in front of the church, he rolls over on his right elbow, and he preaches a 2-word sermon. His last message ever. Agape Elios. brothers, love one another. And later that week he dies. How do you end up being a survivor of rejection, attempted execution, a life of exile, bearing scars, and your final sermon is love people? This is how you heard Jesus say, you're going to have to find a way to deal with offense and move on. So here's part of what happens in our culture when it comes to offense. We're fairly pain averse. I include myself in that. And when we are offended, when life gets difficult, if we're not careful, we become stuck. We become stuck. The divorce, the bankruptcy, the betrayal, the childhood trauma, all that is real. In no way am I trying to dismiss that. But Jesus is saying in this, if I am not careful, the pain that I've experienced can keep me anchored to a moment in time, to a painful experience. And when I am anchored by that, it is very difficult for me to be a disciple, to follow him. And so I think there's process involved, there's healing, there's groups, there might be times with counselor, there's deep prayer. But eventually what I have to do if I'm gonna follow Jesus is I'm gonna have to say, that childhood was painful and unfair, and I'm doing the hard work of getting over it, and I'm gonna shake my childhood off my feet because I can't be anchored to that forever. I gotta follow Jesus. That divorce was so unfair. That betrayal was so deep. My personal failure, my ongoing addictive cycle, it created so much shame in my life, but somehow we have to find a way. And you'll notice at this church, like, we've got a group for everybody because we realize this is a big part of what inhibits us from being able to be disciples is our addictive cycles, our pain and our trauma. And it's not easy. It's not like an overnight deal, but somehow I've got to say, I'm shaking the shame off, the guilt off, because I have to follow Jesus. And so I'm going to surround myself with people that know how to help me move on. So we have to learn how to deal with offense, the hard work, and move forward. Thirdly, being a follower of Jesus means that I am sent. I am sent. So I love what Luke says. He says that they went, and they went from village to village, and they proclaimed the message, the kingdom, the message of the kingdom, and they dealt with the sickness. And when you show up to a new village, there's this idea. It is so helpful to understand this. So your work. Work can't just be about a paycheck if you're a disciple of Jesus. I have to get this into my mind that I am sent as a follower of Jesus wherever I go. I'm sent there, and it's more than profit. I'm not just sent to that school or that hospital or that job site or that office complex. I'm not just sent there in order to get a paycheck. I am commissioned by God to bring the message of the kingdom and the mission of the kingdom into that environment. I'm looking, my eyes are open. On Friday, I met somebody, I'd never met him before. We just happened to meet him by chance. Jen and I were together, and he works in the medical community. And he made this statement, I loved it. He said, my work at the clinic that he works at is my mission field. And I said, that's exactly it. That's exactly, I know you have to be cautious and careful what you say. But he says, I don't want to just treat patients with my medical knowledge. I want to look in their eyes and I want to offer compassion and I want to pray for them long after I've seen them. That's the life of a disciple, is that wherever I go, I realize I'm sent. I just don't show up to the refinery. Say, here I am. I'll do my work. You give me a paycheck. I show up to the refinery and I'm looking around. God, what are you doing in this place? Who needs love? Who can I engage with and bring something of this kingdom you've brought to earth into their life? I talked to a teacher last night after service, She said, it's the most beautiful thing when I can integrate my education. I'm very serious. But those kids, I think about them afterwards. I get up in the morning, I show up 10 minutes early, and I pray over the classroom. That's what it means to be a disciple, is I live on mission. And these 12 disciples, of course, they're moving from village to village and doing these miraculous things. Here's what discipleship looks like in the year 2023. It looks like people being sent every day to different locations. And they bring with them power and authority. And they deal with the things that encumber them. And they travel real light because they trust that Jesus provides whatever they need. And they learn how to deal with pain. They don't ignore it. They don't live in some fanciful world. They actually deal with pain, and they say, I can't stay here forever. I'm finding a way forward because I'm a sent person. I'm sent to this neighborhood I live in. I'm sent to this dysfunctional family I'm a part of. I am on mission with Jesus. I want to conclude with this. So Luke gives us this little picture into Herod. So Herod, you can imagine he's probably a little bit nervous. He had John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin, killed. And he hears that there's this person named Jesus, an upstart rabbi from middle of nowhere, okay? Jesus came from Nazareth, right? It's this tiny little town. They estimate that at the time of Jesus' birth, it was a village of somewhere between 150 and 120 people, all right? So if you're watching this from Broadus, good things come out of little places. And he just shows up on the scene. But when his disciples begin to engage in the mission that Jesus had spent the first 8 chapters of Luke showing them, it creates this buzz in Israel. In the buzz, the questioning what is happening, people who have always been broken are finding healing. People who were opposed to kindness and generosity have their hearts transformed. And it's not just Jesus, it's these 12 other individuals. And Herod says, I gotta find out what's happening. He's perplexed. His assumptions about who God is and what God can do are challenged. And what does he want? He wants to have an audience with Jesus. I gotta find out who this is and what is going on. So often in the church, I wanna be sensitive, I understand this. But if we are not careful in our context here in the United States of America, we can be people who it might be an opposite reaction to what Herod had. Oh, the Christian, roll their eyes. When we are disciples and we're traveling light, and we are dealing with pain, and we understand that we're sent, and we're operating in the authority and power that Jesus has given us. Here's what happens when we are really doing that. People are perplexed. Oh my goodness. Could this be real? And here's what people ultimately want. If that's what Jesus does through ordinary people, I want an audience with Jesus. When the church is operating as the church, not simply as believers, but as disciples, it creates a wellspring of curiosity within culture. This is called, historically, what do they call this? Revival. Revival. We're people who have absolutely dismissed the Bible, the claims of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus. When they see disciples living their lives out, standing up for justice, living this unencumbered life, it creates a curiosity that leads to changed lives.